So friends, this evening we're considering once more the most important question that we could ever address. The question, what is God like? God's there. God's existence is evident from his creation. But what's he like? This is a vital question for you to reflect upon. And you can know the answer because the Bible tells us God has revealed himself to us through both his world and through his word. And so you can know for sure what the living and true God is like. Yet sadly, in many churches today, there's a terrible imbalance. When God is spoken of in these churches, the entire focus is on his love and grace. Of course, God is amazing in grace. And this amazing grace is at the heart of the gospel. And we must proclaim and rejoice in God's astonishing kindness and love every time we gather to worship him. But having said that, we mustn't overlook God's other characteristics. And many today are falling into that trap. They ignore certain truths that God has revealed about himself in the Bible. And in particular, they make little or no mention of God's righteous wrath. And so there is a deadly imbalance in the preaching and in the songs of praise of many churches because they aren't proclaiming a true picture of the living God. And so there is a great need in today's church to rediscover in particular the reality of God's righteous wrath. And singing the Psalms helps us greatly to do that. And the truth of the matter is this. And the truth of the matter is this. It's only as we recognize God's righteous wrath that we really, really marvel at God's amazing grace. For this is what you and I are saved from by trusting in Christ. We're rescued from God's righteous fury at our sin. We're saved from the wrath to come, as Paul wrote to the believers at Thessalonica about. This penetrating passage in Romans is all about God's righteous wrath on unrighteousness. We began our study of it last week, and we considered two key matters in the passage. Firstly, we considered what is the character of God's wrath. We saw that God's wrath is his constant, settled, righteous anger against all the ungodliness and unrighteousness of sinful people like us. God's wrath is not like our unrighteous anger. His wrath is his holy hostility to all sin and evil. Secondly, last time we noted to the cause of God's wrath. This is a key point in this part of Paul's letter, and Paul couldn't be plainer. The apostle could not be more frank. The cause of God's wrath is our rebellion as humankind, sinful men and women like us across the globe rebelling against our Creator. And the truth is, we all know deep down that God, our Creator, exists. We all know of God and of his power through his creation. And we all know that there are such things as right and wrong, and we all know that there will be a judgment. But we're naturally defiant, and we suppress the truth. We keep trying to forget these things. We make ourselves a God who is not the biblical God, who is soft on sin. And we continue on in our sin. And we not only enjoy engaging in our sin, we even encourage others to join us in our sin. This is the appalling state into which humanity has fallen. This is the cause for God's wrath being revealed. Human beings everywhere having turned their backs on God, refusing to honor God as God, the God who made them, the God who gives them every breath that they breathe, and refusing to acknowledge God as the author of all that is good, and refusing to thank God for his gracious blessings day by day. Well, this evening we're moving on with Paul from the cause for God's wrath being revealed to consider the consequences of God's wrath being revealed. What are the results of God's wrath at our rebellion? What are the consequences of man walking out on God? Two horrifying consequences are spelt out here by the apostle, inspired by the Spirit. And these two go together. On the one hand, there is God's righteous punishment. On the other hand, there is man's increasing perversion. To start with, there is God's holy punishment. In his righteous wrath at our rebellion, the holy God of heaven must punish rebels. God cannot leave our rebellion unpunished. Otherwise, he would not be just. Now, we all know that God will punish unrepentant sinners in the future. We've heard about the final day of judgment on the last day. And we're aware that we're heading towards Judgment Day. In Romans chapter 2, verse 5, if you just glance over to chapter 2, verse 5, you can see Paul calls it the day of God's wrath. But God's punishment of defiant rebels isn't just a future reality. No, God punishes stubborn, unrepentant sinners in this present age. That's the whole point of this passage here. This is something we may not be so clear on, but Paul the apostle makes this very plain. God is not an idle spectator of world events tonight. God isn't sitting back just watching human history unfold as if he was passively watching a movie. God is actively involved in human history. Apart from acting in sovereign grace, in saving and sanctifying his people, God is also acting in divine judgment. And day by day, God righteously punishes those who keep hardening their hearts. Yes, in an ongoing way, God is executing judgment on those who remain stubborn in their sinfulness. And so being defiant in disobedience doesn't just have horrifying consequences at the end of this age, or when people are taken from this world when they die. Being defiant in your disobedience against God can have awful ramifications in this present world. In verse 18, Paul tells us that God's righteous wrath is being revealed from heaven now. And then the apostle goes on to explain that this present day punishment, what this present day punishment from God involves. Well, this brings us to man's increasing perversion. Paul uses a most terrifying phrase 3 times in verses 24, 26, and 28 to describe God's punishment. God gave them up. God gave them up. God gave them up. This is how the holy God of heaven punishes defiant rebels in this present age. He gives them up to their depravity. Now note how Paul describes how God gives up the defiant to their depravity. Note the 3 evil exchanges carried out by stubborn sinners. These 3 evil exchanges lead the defiant into deeper and deeper depravity. Firstly, they exchange the glory of God for the glory of created things. Paul spells this out in verses 21 to 24. Defiant human beings know that God's there, but in their stubborn sinfulness, they don't acknowledge him or thank him or honor him because their thinking has become futile and their foolish hearts have become darkened. And though they claim to be so wise, they become fools. And they carry out this first evil exchange that Paul speaks of here. They exchange the glory of the immortal God for the glory of created things. They honor things that are made rather than honoring the living God who made them. In their utter folly, they worship images resembling mortal man, birds, animals, and reptiles. But they fail to worship the maker of the heavens and the earth. Now, such sin is called idolatry. And of course, idolatry wasn't just rampant in Paul's day. Idolatry is also rife in our own day. For we live in an age when people are consumed by consumerism. We live in an age when people are preoccupied with possessions. We live in an age when people are fixated with fashion, fame, and financial gain. We live in an age when people are captivated with celebrity and taken up with technology. Our society has sold out its soul to materialism. For most people are lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. Well, when human beings honor created things rather than their creator, there are the most serious consequences. God punishes them. How? Well, God actually gives them over to their evil desires. Yes, as shocking as it will sound to you and me, God actually abandons those who harden their hearts, and God gives them over to their sin. God lets them go deeper and deeper into their depravity, in their folly. Unbelievers might like the sound of this, of God leaving them alone to get on with their sinful lives. But this is a most dreadful fate, because when God abandons them in their sin, they become totally enslaved by their ungodly desires, and they reap the most catastrophic consequences. For the sins they set their hearts upon have evil effects. As they degrade their bodies with one another, they become more and more dominated by their depravity. Friends, the history of mankind confirms this. When people give themselves to idolatry, immorality takes over. A false view of God leads to a false understanding of how to live, and especially of sexual relations. At this point, Paul does not spell out the kind of immorality he had in mind, but Paul says that this immorality involves the degrading of their bodies with one another. And of course, this is the truth of the matter. Illicit sex degrades people's humanness, whereas sex within marriage, as God intends, ennobles people's humanness. And so here Paul spells out one awful aspect of this downward spiral into deeper and deeper depravity for defiant rebels. In their rebellion, they exchange the eternal glory of the Creator for the passing glory of created things. My friend, what about you tonight? This is the most pressing issue in your life. Are you falling into this trap of idolatry? Are you preoccupied with those things that you can see and touch rather than pursuing the one who's invisible? Millions upon millions upon millions of our fellow men are falling into this deadly trap. They are captivated by the things of this world. They give no thought to the Creator who made all things. They're taken up with the transient glory of the stars and celebrities of this generation, or they're simply taken up with the wonders of the world and the beauty of the created order. But they're blind to the eternal glory of the King of creation. What about you? Who or what has got your attention the most? Stars of stage or sport, celebrities who glory in the limelight. The glitz and glamour of this age can appear so attractive, but its glory is so temporary and fleeting. Or is it the riches of this world or the pleasures of this life that you focus on the most? Or is it the wonders of the world and the beauty of the created order? I exhort you to set your heart not on the things of this world, but on the one who's enthroned in eternal glory. Do not grasp for or glory in the treasures of this life. Rather, glory in King Jesus, who is the pearl of great price. Delight yourself in the sovereign Saviour, the treasure of all treasures. Don't let anyone or anything take first place in your life apart from him. In all your ways acknowledge Christ as your Lord and seek his honour in everything you do. Christian friends, idolatry isn't just a deadly danger for unbelievers. In this fallen world, idolatry will always be a temptation for us as well. For by nature, our hearts are idolatrous. Calvin says our hearts are idol factories, and our hearts focus so quickly on our selfish desires. That's why John exhorts us at the end of his first letter, little children, keep yourselves from idols. Keep yourself from anything or anyone who would take Christ's place in your life. And so, as defiant sinners go deeper into depravity, they exchange the glory of God with the glory of created things. Secondly, they exchange the truth of God for a lie. And what the Apostle Paul refers to here is the ultimate lie. Because this lie leads us to turn away from God, to pursue pleasure and satisfaction in other things. This is a despicable lie, because it claims that created things are deserving of our wholehearted devotion, whereas the Lord alone is worthy of our devotion and worship. Yet this is how most of our fellow men live their lives, because by nature they just want God's gifts. They've no desire for God himself. They've no concern for his glory. Once again, this leads to God's punishment. And this is spelt out very solemnly in verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonourable practices. And now Paul specifies these shameful lusts and practices in verses 26 and 27. In verse 26, Paul mentions lesbian practices. In verse 27, he speaks of male homosexual relationships. In both cases, Paul describes the people concerned as guilty of a third evil exchange. They exchange natural relations for unnatural ones. Verse 26, the woman exchanged natural relations for unnatural ones. Verse 27, the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passions for one another. It's striking and significant how Paul uses the adjectives natural and unnatural. Clearly, it's crucial to know what Paul means by these terms. In society today, there is a heated debate about homosexuality. And in this debate, the meaning of these terms, natural and unnatural, is often twisted. And many will say that what natural means here is what seems natural to me. And therefore, we often hear homosexuals say, homosexuality is natural for me. This is what I am. But the term natural here doesn't mean what is natural to me. Natural here refers to God's created order. Natural here means how God has ordered nature. And so to act against nature, to act unnaturally, means to violate the order which God established at creation, whereas to act according to nature means to behave in accordance with the intention of the Creator. And our Creator's intention is clear. He spelled it out in Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, and Jesus confirmed it in Matthew 19, verse 4 onwards. At the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. and said, "For this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. And so they are no longer two, but one." Then Jesus added his personal endorsement and exhortation. "Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate." Therefore, God has created us male and female. Our first ancestors were Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And God has instituted marriage as a heterosexual union. What God has thus united, we've no liberty to separate. God plainly intends that the one flesh experience is for heterosexual marriage. Therefore, a homosexual partnership is against nature. However loving and committed such a partnership may be, it can never be regarded as a legitimate alternative to marriage, for it's against God's order and law, and so it is sinful. This sin of homosexuality was rampant in Paul's day, and of course it's become increasingly prevalent and public in our own day. And the LGBTQ plus movement is militant in promoting its perverse views. Along with other grievous sins, homosexuality is repeatedly condemned in Scripture. But people in their folly want to be their own gods, and they want to decide for themselves what's right and wrong. And so they refuse to listen to the author of nature, and they do their own thing. Well, because of this, God gives them over to unrestrained affections for sin. And so the result is widespread sexual perversion, which is what we see happening today. And we've got to the point where the governments in the UK and Ireland have changed the marriage laws to include homosexual union. It's shocking and alarming, but friends, this is very much part of God's punishment on our secular societies. This is all part of God's holy wrath on our godless nations. His wrath being revealed from heaven against us. When we hear of God's wrath, we usually think of thunderbolts from heaven and earthly cataclysms and flaming majesty. But that's for the future, when King Jesus returns in awesome power and glory with his hosts of mighty angels. In this present age, God's righteous wrath goes quietly and invisibly to work in handing over stubborn sinners to themselves and to their own sinful practices and devices. And so God's wrath at this stage in world history operates not so much by God's intervention, but rather by his non-intervention, by letting men and women who are unrepentant go their own way. What a sobering, startling reality. God abandons unrepentant rebels and stubborn sinners to their willful self-centeredness and self-indulgence. Therefore, friends, the moral, spiritual degeneration of our day is actually an act of judgment by God, our judge. This is all part of his punishment upon our countries. As nations filled with sexual perversions, we are already nations under God's judgment, and we're ripe for worse punishment from God, as the Old Testament history of Sodom and Gomorrah warns. Now, my Christian friends, this should not drive you and me to despair. Rather, this should drive us to prayer. We must cry out daily to the God of heaven that in his righteous wrath that he will remember mercy when it comes to our nation. These verses are such an apt description of our 21st century society. Idolatry is rife, not only throughout the land, but also within the professing church. And so is immorality, because immorality frequently follows on the heels of idolatry. Christian friend, Are you deeply grieved tonight by the godlessness of our age? Is your heart crying out the words of Psalm 85? O turn us back, our saving God, your anger toward us put away. Will your anger be on us? Your wrath prolonged always. Will you not give us life anew? Your people then will joy in you. Because friends, this is us in Romans chapter 1. This terrible picture that Paul paints here is a portrait of our own nations, of the UK and Ireland, this day and age. We are the RP Church in Ireland, and we're part of the UK, and in Ireland we see the same thing happening, secularism taking over. And we haven't even come to the end of Paul's dreadful description of the deepening depravity of defiant rebels. For sadly, there's still more awful things to say about our sinful society. Look at verse 28. Men do not want God in their thoughts at all. So what does God do? God punishes them by giving them over to a debased mind. God gives them over to twisted thinking without any divine restraint whatsoever. And such a depraved mind cannot make wise choices or right judgments. And so worse evils are bound to follow. Indeed, a chaos of evils is inevitable. And that's exactly what Paul describes in verses 29 to 32. Paul catalogues here in verses 29 to 32 a whole variety of antisocial practices which destroy society. And the list is truly shocking. For when people have driven God out of their minds, they don't know how to treat each other as those made in the image of God. And so sin against God leads to all sorts of sins against our fellow men. Invariably, there's a breakdown in community, a whole range of relationships fracture, standards disappear, society disintegrates. Paul gives us a catalogue of 21 vices here. He begins with 4 terms which convey the sinfulness of defiant rebels: wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. Then the apostle lists 5 more sins which dominate the lives of stubborn sinners: envy, murder, strife, deceit, and malice. Verse 29. And these sins cause untold hurt and lead to an awful breakdown in human relationships. Next, Paul mentions 2 terrible vices to do with our speech, vices which cause grief to many: gossiping and slandering. And then Paul notes 4 dreadful sins which stem from pride: hatefulness of God, insolence, arrogance, and boastfulness. And then Paul tells us that stubborn sinners are actually inventive when it comes to sin. They invent ways of doing evil. And note that Paul puts disobedience to parents in this list of dreadful sins. Disobeying our parents is no small matter in God's eyes. And then he brings his list to an end with 4 negatives. Stubborn sinners like this are senseless, faithless, heartless, and ruthless. Or as one writer puts it, those who are determined in their defiance against God are without brains, without honour, without love, or without pity. What a horrifying, humbling picture of human perversity in our day. And look at how Paul ends this passage about the perversion of the human race. He says, we know God's righteous decree that those who do such things deserve death. We know that the wages of sin is death, and our consciences condemn us. And yet, what do stubborn sinners do? They not only keep doing these very things, which they know deserve God's punishment, they actually actively encourage others to practice the very same perversities. They approve and they applaud others involved in such evil. Friends, what a shocking state stubborn sinners are in, getting deeper and deeper into depravity. They make these 3 evil exchanges: glorying in created things rather than in their Creator, listening to lies rather than to God's truth, engaging in unnatural relations rather than in natural ones. Therefore, God punishes them in this present age by giving them over to their sin, so that they plummet further and further into their perversion. What a warning! If people keep rebelling against the light of God's revelation, God judges them by taking the light away from them. And all that is left is the pitch darkness which they have chosen and to which God has consigned them. Friends, politicians and people everywhere are up in arms about the decline in morals in our generation. But such a decline in morals is the consequence of our spiritual rebellion and God giving us over to our depravity. This is what most of our fellow men fail to see. Many want to fix our decline in morals, but the only answer is to return to the Lord. And that's the one thing that people naturally do not want to do. May God in his holy wrath remember mercy upon our secular society and nation. And may he humble us as nations and bring us to our senses and to our knees and cause a great turning again to Christ. Let us join in prayer.